thank you, Dr. Bisanti, for your participation. Now we will pass to our Q&A session. So I'm going to ask you to please identify yourself like in the previous round, and that you please tell us who the question is aimed at. So, first of all, congratulations. These were extraordinary presentations. They were very, very enlightening, and I have 3 points that I wish to mention. I want to see your reactions. It has to do first with. Okay, so maybe you're going to make me choose. I'm Gerardo Leiva of the INEGI, and this is not confidential information. As part of the work of the INEGI, the way in which we've obtained information throughout the years has been first directly through a direct relation with the company, with the informant. More recently, and this we do through surveys or census. In some European countries, administrative records are an important source of official statistic information. So there's an office which is part of the public sector, and the step we are taking now is saying, okay, we're going to exploit the potentials of big data to obtain information which we can give official use to, but we have a private intermediary, which is Google or Twitter or Facebook or something of this nature. So what happens here is that there's two things we'd like to pay attention to. One is, well, a relationship, and when we have very few providers of final information for the interests of the state. So we have companies that end up being intermediaries for a large amount of information that is afterwards going to be used for issues of importance for a country. And this is almost monopoly in which they close the source of data, and then what are we going to do? So what are we going to do with this lack of balance between few informants with a lot of information and the statistic agencies? I think it's just an issue worth reflecting. It has to have the possibility of opening the possibilities of competition. Otherwise, we're restricting a market that has a quite small amount of members. So first, state legislation needs to be open. Second, I think we need to consider something else. I don't know what you think about this, but the state at this moment has the possibilities of providing patterns or a series of data, which is raw. We could call it raw. In other words, this raw data, we need to create patterns of knowledge that help obtain this on patterns of consumption in different areas. So we need to stop focusing on search engines and think that it may be other companies that in the market can use this information and that can generate raw data without necessarily using Yahoo, Google, etc. This is possibly our first consideration. If we open the market to other companies that can generate other types of patterns and generate these types of patterns to any sector of the economy of which it could be of use. Any other answer? Yes, it's very hard to find an answer to your concern, Gerardo, which I think is very valid. The state has lost competencies compared to those of private companies. because of through the census it can ensure, let's say, let's always add a margin of error to this, but they can ensure that they can obtain the census of all individuals and through various actors determine what the margin of error is for this. We also have then individuals obtaining greater volumes that they can use fast for decisions of the state. I think we can't speak of a new social contract. We have internet has been highly successful, not just the internet, but just IT and other industries, thanks to the fact that it has allowed unrestricted access of private actors to this. So we've tested during 30 years the values of free and open markets. Countries in which markets are free and open, in which opening and closing a company is easier, have brought more innovation to this. I don't want to mechanically say this, but you can tell. It's inevitable to notice this. However, we're running into unintended consequences. Companies have more information than the state, of information that is of interest to the state. Companies are less regulated than states in treating this data. The relevance of this by allowing, well, by the state deciding what the questions are going to be through open data and open government are larger. So I see an obligation that we reflect upon this further to see how we will rebuild this relation. The state must pay more attention to certain things. Why the Library of Congress does it decide to keep all of Twitter? Because they know that this is the information which historians of further generations will analysis. Why does the Library of Mexico restrict itself to printed books in Mexico, and why do they not accept electronic books? Well, because they consider it will destroy the possibilities of this market. So this speaks of the parameters of this new contract. We're facing a change of paradigm, and it has an influence on several subjects. Okay, this is working. You can see this in different areas. If you're a software mobile application development, the fact that you sell your application or not depends on two different stores which control the mobile business. If you return to a search engine, if a search engine is angry with you and sends you to place 400 of your search engine, you have no way to discuss this. You could through competency, but it's difficult. And the fact is that we are finding this everywhere. So I think the current framework does not offer this in any country that I know. Has this been discussed to a point where it provides an adequate legal solution? And the way in which companies are avoiding this from happening is from not being bad, but do no evil. Well, this is what's working best, and avoiding the regulator from entering in. The difficulty is that there's starting to be problems. We're running into situations that are hard to solve, and the regulator is beginning to come in. And in the case of a right to forget, well, they're creating a patch which is political because there's no norm that allows to consider the fact that because he's the first result, he's losing customers, losing money. He's so this is not being solved yet, and as part of these balances, we're trying to to yes, a series of the considerations of all these actors. My question is, do we really need a norm? I think that at the end of the day, agreements, schemes of operation, yes, but creating a norm in itself will not. Or what might happen is what's happening now. In the face of a situation or presenting the well, we're presenting a project and this is going to generate an additional norm. I think what's happening here is that we are so sensitive to the information or the excesses of information because we've generated it by creating restrictions that shouldn't be as restrictive. So there's another important Mexican saying, which is you shouldn't put the candle too close to Saint or it might burn, but you shouldn't put it too far or you won't give him any light. So we must operate in a way that is much more competitive as a government together with private entities. I think you raise your hand. Yes, I'm Lorena from the Mexican Postal Service. With regards to what Alejandro Pisanti mentioned on the prescription of a name, I think all governments of the world need to act for the benefit of the population. So after the economic um, crisis, you have all these people who, in the credit bureau, who, because of problems, are facing disgrace. And maybe Leandro knows if there's an agreement when these people will be erased, because the government can can know of people who, because of macroprudential norms, you shouldn't be able to occupy this, and this bad reputation. I don't know when it expires. If there's a world agreement of this, because this um stops the and because small and medium companies fell, it was like a domino effect. If we had big data of all the companies that entered the credit bureau from 2008 forward, we could measure the this question is for Leandro. Okay, this is a topic which it's normally you ask, oh, I'm happy you asked this to me, and yes, I am happy because I was in the world group of the World Bank for the establishment of not a credit bureau, but of for bank information services on these subjects. They didn't want to call it credit bureau because what the World Bank wanted to have was to have a positive and a negative one. It, one in which they could know how much money you have before you pay, and that way they can go beyond this. So the issue of there's no expiration. In Spain, we have one, which is 5 years. After 5 years, you leave the credit bureau, but at the international level, we have no criteria. So we've spoken of a principle of quality to the point where this reflects the reality of a person. This is absolutely ambiguous. It gives no legal certainty. How do you, well, Alfredo says that regulation is not the case. So, you know what happens in this, in here? Well, in the economic world, we have externalities. All these businesses are generating externalities that affect third parties, and the company doesn't care. It's like the person who pollutes. They don't care if they pollute. They make money, they grow, they bring in better results, and contamination or pollution affects other people. If they're polluting a river, well, they're not affected. It affects the people downstream. In the digital world, something similar happens. We have externalities that are hard to solve, and regulation is inevitable, or self regulation, which is also an option and which should be used more often. In the regulatory sense, it's like a pendulum. If we're here without regulation, then the state regulates, it goes here. And maybe the middle ground is here, but it's gone to the other direction. The pendulum is moving, 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 and finally there's a balance, and this can take many years. At the end of the day, it's about being aware of your own externalities. Bureaus need to consider their own actions. You sanction the person who is in the bureau, but not the bureau in itself, because you need to find a balance, a balance, a balance. But sometimes we would like it to be fast, but we don't obtain this. Alfredo. Yes, with regards to this issue in specific, there in Mexico there is a period, and let me tell you something interesting. This is a case of exception of people who have this. This excludes societies of credit information, and the norm for information, credit information, well, this exception was incorrect in my opinion, because who gathers your information to give you a credit? The Society of Credit Information, or the user of the bureau, which could be a financial institution or a store, or in this sense, the users of the bureau are, well, the credit bureau norm applies to them, as well as the the law, for because they're not excluded from the norm. So even though they need to obey the law of the credit norms, they need to obey the law for the protection of private data, which establishes a time frame. So that this is interesting, and it's also complicated, because if there's any change to this, what norm does the credit bureau pay attention to the one that affects him more? And well, the law of protection of data is very strong, so it's an autonomous institute by now, but it's still called an IFI. If there's a right to forgetfulness, does this apply? You apply it to the same person, Alejandro. Okay, I'm going to allow a question, and if my comments are relevant, I'll answer. Yes, I wanted to mention something with the right to forget, is that this is a conflict between fundamental rights, access to information, and access to privacy. So there's something we need to consider, that something we forget. Within 100 years, we're going to be a society without history, because if we need to keep a certain history of society, we can't also want to censure, because society is what it is. And when we speak of norms, I think it's complex, that we may have regulators that determine what's prevalent, because it may speak of fundamental rights. It's difficult for the administration to involve. Sorry, we have no sound back here. We don't have any sound. I apologize. I'm Gabriela Segovia V5. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss access of information and protection of data, but I'm going to ask something that's very distant from this. I want to ask Alejandro Pisanti if you could mention, if briefly, a reference to the semantic web, and how this promise of innovation can be affected by new ambitions of governance, or some type of control on the internet. And well, to Mr. Nunez, well, just to say that you were mentioning the efforts for anonymization, and this with the purpose of using the information while still considering the privacy of individuals. But I don't understand how you mentioned that you need to renovate the certification of anonymization every time you use this. Could you clarify this? At some point, it says when we're able to anonymize data, we're ready to use them. But every time we're going to use this, we need to do an anonymization. Was it like this? Well, these are my two questions, and congratulations to the panelists. This is definitely a great discussion. Thank you. I'm going to be very brief, very prudent. Thank you for this. Web Semantica is a technology that allows us to access information if we implement it correctly. In other words, if you're a friend of Tim Berners-Lee and you're frustrated because people don't understand him. Okay, I'm gonna name drop here, but I was at dinner and where Berners-Lee was discussing with VinTransfer the implementation specifically of what we call linked data, which are triads of information, and it's clear that it's unclear. That's the most honest point of view. Here at Infotech, we have been working for the semantic web, and we've spoken with the people who are knowledgeable on this, and the most likely first successful applications of web semantica takes place in small, well delimited clusters of data. The problem is with the ontologies, which is to delimit and create this. So web semantica is, well, the people who are part of web semantica should know this. Well, they don't introduce a new, radically different coordinate with regards to what has been said here. We're assuming a series of superhuman capabilities for treatment of data. So if Web Semantica complies with this, they will continue to be superhuman. The concerns expressed are being considered, are being attended, so they are, well, data treatment services are already enough, but at the risk of being contradicted here, well, I say this. The other point I want to mention here, Gabriel, is something I've insisted on insufficiently, which is that issues of treatment of large clusters of data must be subject not of regulation of a government, but spontaneously, and this should happen, and this should be intensified. There should be governance in which we take advantage of our experiences in environment or internet for multi-sectorial or multi-stakeholder management. And in the case of big data, this requires political vision, legal vision, the vision of organizations dedicated to access to information or delimitation of access to this information because of privacy concerns or legal concerns. But this is discussion that without engineers and computer scientists will go nowhere, because it's like trying to regulate internet without considering the competencies and limitations of technology. We write analogies with things such as the laws of the ocean or the law of the Antarctic, but there's an important difference in the sense that, well, philosophically, the ocean may be seen as a cultural construction. The truth is that the cultural construction of the ocean will not change more than 1% the volume of water in the seas, but nor will it change in more than 1% its salinity or pH, even if those can be critical changes to life, whereas changes in the internet are being built, so you can't um, the issue of right to forgetting and the resolution on Costeja is that um, he didn't speak enough to engineers.
So I should have discussed it further with engineers in order to make a more sustainable decision that could also be expanded and scaled. These are the terms that us geeks are concerned about in this field. Thank you. Regarding anonymization, it is possible that when I leave this room, an engineer will try to kill me or something, because what I'm gonna say from a technical standpoint might be somewhat deficient. But to work with big data, we work with platforms called DMTs, by the foreign acronym of these data management platforms. Supposedly, these are large bins in which we enter information. This information is being worked with in order to obtain information, intelligence from it. This is a gross idea. However, when we introduce data there, the important thing would be introducing them already anonymized, because when we already work with them at the machine, we work with them in aggregation. So the only thing we do then is to increase certain criteria that are not necessarily stored in a structured manner. This is not necessary for them to be like that. What they do is to add information, to anonymize it as much as possible in order not to be able to identify this person again, associate the data with that person's identity. But it is not necessary to re-anonymize what is already on the machine, because it's supposedly already anonymized. Another thing would be to introducing so much information that it is possible to make the information so concrete and so specific that the, the identity of the people's information could be exposed. I understand that anonymization is when the information is loaded to the platform, or when the platform can have access to that data in order to work with it while it is being hosted elsewhere. Now, Javier has asked me to ask to make a clarification from the strictly legal standpoint in terms of anonymization. We should find a protocol to make a separation in this topic. When we are discussing anonymization, what we are doing is to make personal information lose that feature that is being personal. So in this case, there are legal problems regarding whether consent of the user's owner is needed, or if their agreement is needed, or if the owner of that data has the right to a certain compensation. Now, let me give you an example that might be surprising, but it is as follows. When we are talking to an agriculture farmer that grows potatoes, the manufacturer of chips would buy these potatoes and treat them. It is clear that the potato grower does not have any rights on the brand, the chips brand potatoes. We should find out if the consumer has the right to receive an indemnization when its information is used, even if it's subject to an anonymization process. What we need to be clear about is when we discuss anonymization, what we need to do is to lower the profile of privacy, because we're working in the opposite direction to privacy. We're talking about something that ceases to be personal. It is a piece of data that could be attributed to any individual. And then there's another series of problems that need to be deeply analyzed in terms of civil law. For example, if the responsible of the file, person that is in charge of its treatment, or if a third party has the same rights to perform this anonymization process, or if we need to find legal differences that are structural in nature between all the stakeholders that participate in this anonymization process. It is not the same. Somebody that has the control of a certain type of data conduit for this information to be re-anonymized, to the people that have responsibilities over these files and that have that data under the safeguards. It is necessary to make the lower possible intervention in order to find the higher level of self-regulation of control, but it's still self-regulation. So there are other aspects in the process of anonymization of this data. And these are, for example, the defense of competition, to defend from disloyal competition. Through this anonymization process will prevent others from finding out industrial information, for instance. There are other important aspects that could be mentioned. I anonymize and I make anonymization patterns. Who has the right, the property rights over these patterns? Let us suppose that I anonymize and I do that, and I fail at that. Who would then be civilly liable by this for this faulty anonymization, because that is a critical factor regarding this process. There are many aspects, but I repeat, a message that I think has to be conveyed is twofold. First, simplicity in this process that needs to be much more simpler in terms of big data, and we also need to reduce the level of privacy and the level of big data regulation precisely to favor the development of big data both in the field of public administration as well as on the side of companies. Thank you very much, Javier. We only have 10 minutes left before we finish this session, and I am going to ask a question that was asked by Twitter to Mr. Jimenez Kraft by Julia from UNAM, that asks us what indicators besides electronic transactions might be accurate to use for big data and e-commerce. What indicators besides electronic transactions might be accurate to be used in big data and e-commerce? Well, there are a lot of them. It could be the time at which the transaction was made or the purchase was made. It could be the geographic location of the terminal where such a transaction took place. It could also be this pays or everything that has been bought in a length of time or whatever has been purchased throughout the day. If that day rained, there are other geographical considerations. If there was heavy traffic that day, if there was a football match that day, if Germany scored the 2 or 3 goals, all of that has an influence. You can take any number of indicators, and based on that, you can determine profiles of consumption, for example, during a time of the day, or purchase preferences of products, of what consumers prefer, where will people will go to acquire these goods. That is the sort of information that might be obtained. Ricardo, do you want to make a comment? Well, there are some that we call black legends and this field. But for example, there are experiences such as if you erase cookies after doing research about flights at a certain destination for a date. If you erase the cookies, then the flights would appear later on cheaper. And many of us are paranoidly convinced that books the books that we are of our specialty are sold to us at a higher rate than to other people. If I try to buy a book about the internet governance, Amazon will try to sell it to me at $100, and if I go over the internet with somebody else's account, then probably that is being sold at $10. Well, in many cases of e-commerce, it is reasonably documented that the personalization of interests by means of cookies and all the different types of data that are, however they are obtained. Well, in the case of Amazon or in the case of the supermarket, you are purchasing with an account, you are fully identified. And you signed a privacy agreement, and you signed the biggest joke of the century, and we're only at the beginning, which is consent or agreement. And I am sorry, there are attorney colleagues, but agreement or consent is the joke of the century. Nobody reads it. Nobody, not even if you try to understand it, not even if it is in your own language. It is still a joke. You will not change from supermarket if there is only one that will deliver in your area just because the other treats your data in a more favorable way for you. When we started to discuss personal data treatment in e-commerce, there was the expectation that there could be a sort of competition between companies in terms of how suppliers treat customers' data. So in that case, theoretically, providers of the same goods and services would be competing with each other for the customers based on the data treatment policies or their privacy policies, but in reality that does not happen. First, there are not so many possible suppliers. There's only one Amazon, and there are a few book suppliers that can compete with it. It is not a monopoly, but uh, they do not get to the same volume. And the second phenomenon that takes place is that since everybody has the same interest for the benefit of the consumer to personalize or to customize the consumer's experience, there is a phenomenon of a phenomenon that has not been characterized legally, because we see that from in terms of cartel creation, and that is not solely related to drugs. There was the resistance of the tire industry in Mexico that prevented the entrance of Michelin. There were silver surfers. Remember that in Mexico, tires would last 80,000 kilometers, and the Mexican tire industry wanted to prevent the entrance of Michelin and Pirelli tires because it would last for 300,000 kilometers. So we already knew about this cartel formation about certain products. When in the past, on every meeting of 30 people, somebody would wake up and find their tires deflated or actually punctured. But this price setting aspect has not been very much studied by economists and much less by attorneys. But it's a phenomenon of collusion between suppliers. Amazon and Google Books do not need to sign an agreement to do this, or Gandhi and the Sodno bookstore, two national examples, have might have taken this information management to extreme levels because there are no consumers to complain about this or sufficient competence for this to be prevented. This is having more actors in this field. There is only 5 more minutes, so two of our panelists wanted to add some comments about confidentiality, and we also have a question from the main auditorium from Ana Linia Hernandez Rodriguez from the Ministry of Finance of the State of Mexico, and she asks what informatic tools would be more adequate for big data use. Javier and Alfredo, however, wants to conclude. Well, regarding consent, as Alejandro just expressed it, it is important to consider the evolution of consent systems. When we discuss privacy, we all remember the typical confidentiality clause that needs to be signed for any company, and that we have gone to a system which you just check a box on any website. And with big data, what is very important is what we call digital waste. For example, the behavior or the responsibility that the people have when entering and going out of the internet. For example, if we're watching a football match and we want to know what were the results of a certain match, we can go in and out of a website 20 times. That multiplied by all the consumers that are following the result of the match through that website shows the level of anxiety that every consumer has. Generally, well, in general terms, but at that time, if we are no longer in front of that signature or that this disclaimer that nobody reads. What is very important at this time is that in order to generate big data, individual responsibility regarding our own responsibility is a determining factor in absolute terms. I totally agree with Javier, and that is another typical example of the excessive of overregulation, of excessive regulatory zeal. What does the law state in terms of privacy notices? It has to be simple, clear, and specific. Now, what is under regulation? Well, at the ends, explain them, and what are the guidelines, and then more information than that. So we are making things a lot more complicated. That from the start was sought to be understandable and readable by the final consumer or the data owner. Well, thank you very much. Any responses to this final question about what tools are available? Well, I'm very glad that this question is being asked by somebody from Minister of Finance of the state, and the answer is only one word: stay, because technological tools are the purpose of this entire seminar. So on behalf of Infotech and the Joint Board of Innovation and Knowledge, I thank our panelists for their attendance and you for your attendance as well. It is time for a break, and now we will present our speakers with these awards for their presentation today. Thank you.